Hi, in this video we're going to continue looking at the task 1 question that we've been looking at in recent videos. If you remember, this was the task. You can see we've got two line graphs there, one with quite a lot of information and another with not quite so much. So far we've looked at how I would write an introduction and then an overview in a separate paragraph. So far we've looked at 2 paragraphs. Now we need to move on to look at how we would write the next 2 paragraphs, which are the detail paragraphs. Now in this video, what I want to do is just look at the first detail paragraph and how we would write that. Of course, what we're going to do here is actually separate the details into 2 paragraphs. Now I know there are some teachers, some books that don't tell you to separate this information into 2 paragraphs, and you don't have to. You can include all of the details in 1 paragraph if you want. There's no rule that says you have to separate that information. But I think it really helps to organize the details into 2 separate paragraphs, really following the structure that we used for our overview. If you remember, in our overview paragraph, we had 1 sentence about that first line graph and 1 sentence about the second line graph. So it would make sense if we had 1 paragraph for our details that kind of goes into more detail on that first sentence in our overview, and a second detail paragraph that goes into a bit more detail on that second sentence of our overview. Kind of makes our writing flow nicely and have this nice clear structure that has some logic to it, right? It's logically going from kind of this simple information to more complex information in our details, and we're organizing it quite well to make it clear and easy to read. Now, of course, the detail paragraph that we're going to write first is about that line graph at the top with more information than the line graph at the bottom there, the second line graph. So that first detailed paragraph is probably going to be a bit longer than the second detailed paragraph, and we're going to look at that first today. Usually I recommend students to use 3 sentences for these paragraphs, these detailed paragraphs, because we want to increase the size of our paragraphs gradually. Remember, the introduction was 1 sentence, the overview was 2 sentences. Now, of course, the details are going to be 3 sentences each. Now, this can vary and change depending on what you're writing about. It would be okay to maybe just write 2 sentences if those sentences are quite long and complex sentences. You could get away with that. And maybe there is a chance that you could write maybe even a 4-sentence detailed paragraphs if maybe some of the sentences were a bit shorter and more simple. The detailed paragraph that we're going to look at today is going to be a 3-sentence detailed paragraph, and we're going to just be describing that first line graph. What we'll do is we'll basically just go through what we can see happening in this graph, what it shows us from the beginning to the end. Of course, the first sentence is going to start at the beginning, and then gradually we're going to move to the end of that line graph and what it shows us at the end of that 100-year period. We're going to separate it a bit into 3 sentences. What I'm going to do now is just show you each of those 3 sentences, sentence by sentence, and just explain to you what we're doing in these sentences and, well, why it's appropriate and why it would get a high score from an examiner. So let's look at the first sentence of our detail paragraph. You can see here we've begun by referring to the time, the year, in 1920. This is a great way to begin a line graph when you're describing the details. So beginning the details of a line graph. We begin with time and we begin at the beginning. That would make complete sense. It would be strange to start describing a graph at the end of the period. So we start at the beginning in 1920. What we're going to do, and what you can see we've done in this sentence, is describe all three of the figures for that year. So all three appliances are described in this one sentence, and we're going to be comparing them. We're going to compare the two higher figures with the much lower figure. So if you look at this sentence here, we've started by giving the percentages. That's what we want to do here. We've got to include specific percentages. So we've said 40% of households had a washing machine. That's the beginning, right? We haven't finished there, of course. We're using the past simple tense there because, of course, we're talking about or writing about 1920. And then we're adding more information, more similar information. It's not so different. So we're using the word and to connect it. And 30% owned a vacuum cleaner. So we've got these two electrical appliances, washing machine and vacuum cleaner. We've changed the verb slightly, right? We've got had in the first part and owned in the second part because we want to have that variety. We don't want to repeat the word had too much. So we've used the verb owned, which would have the same meaning in this context. But again, we haven't finished there, right? We've got to compare with the much lower figure. And you can see here I've written it slightly differently as well. But first we've got the conjunction while after a comma to show we're comparing. We've got something quite different. While those with a refrigerator accounted for under 5%. So the structure we're using to give a specific figure here is actually slightly different. Notice we haven't begun with the percentage. The percentage here is at the end. We've started with the word those, which is referring to households. We are not repeating the word households here, but we're using a pronoun to refer to the households that were mentioned in the first part of the sentence. So those with a refrigerated accounted for under 5%. No change in tense there, we're just using the past simple again. So we're just giving those three figures in the first year. No changes yet. We're starting at the beginning. Now, of course, then we have to move on, right, to look at the change in the next sentence. The way we're going to do that here is go all the way to the end straight away. If we just had one line graph, we might not go straight to the end. We might just move to somewhere in the middle of that graph, or maybe to where it kind of stops increasing so significantly. But I think here, because we've got to include all of this in one paragraph, because of course the next paragraph is going to be about the other line graph, well, we've got to really go straight to the end. So if you look at the sentence we're using here to describe that change, we've begun the sentence with the phrase over the following 100 years. So we're moving forward a lot here. In fact, over the whole time that the graph is showing, over the following 100 years. So this is a nice way to kind of move on and show again that we're giving the time expression at the beginning of the sentence. So then if you look at this sentence, we're describing a change. So we've got this kind of trend language in that sentence. If you look here, homes with a vacuum cleaner and those with a refrigerator rose dramatically. Okay, so let's focus on that first before we look at the specific figures. We're describing the change of the ownership of two appliances, the vacuum cleaner and refrigerator. We've used a different word to refer to households here. Instead, we've said homes. And then we've got this kind of word or verb and adverb collocation to describe the change. Rose dramatically. Again, just using the past simple tense, but we're making sure we're describing that change in quite a lot of detail because we've got the adverb rose dramatically. So we've got this big rise, right? A significant rise from beginning to end there. Also, if you look in the next part of the sentence, we've actually described the change when we're using the preposition by. So this means we're describing how much the change was, not the point that it reached. So we've got rose dramatically by around 70% and 95% respectively. We haven't even finished the sentence here, but of course we're giving those two figures, 70% and 95%. We've used the word around there just to show we can't be exactly sure on the exact percentage as it's a line graph. I think with this one, sometimes we're not using around or about or approximately just because it's got lines in the line graph, and sometimes we can see quite clearly, but sometimes we can't. So we're using the word around there to show we're not 100% sure. And of course, I need to kind of show that the 70% is about the vacuum cleaner ownership and 95% is about the refrigerator ownership. So we're using the word respectively here to show that. But we're adding a bit more detail as well at the end here, because of course those increases means that, well, it's 100% now by the end. All households have these two appliances. So we've got a comma and then we've got this phrase, meaning all households had these appliances. Still using the past tense, right? Because the graph is not showing us now, although we could assume that still this is the case. Our job is not to assume anything in these detailed paragraphs or in task one. We're just summarizing and comparing the information we've been given. Now, of course, there is another appliance, and the ownership of this appliance has to be mentioned as well. But we're leaving this to another sentence because we're comparing something that is slightly different. Okay, because the other appliance is not one that's owned by all households. So if you look in this third and final sentence of our first detail paragraph, we begin with the word however. Then we say, again, referring to time, by 2019. This is a nice phrase to use when we've reached the end of a line graph, the end of the time period, by 2019. The reason we're doing this is so we can show off a bit of different grammar, actually a different tense here. If you have a look in the rest of the sentence here, we say the figure for washing machine ownership. Well, it's worth mentioning what we're doing here as well. Rather than repeating again the percentage of households with, we've said the figure for. It's quite clear what this is referring to by the end of this paragraph. And we've said washing machine ownership rather than saying the households owned or the households had or households with, homes with. We're using another kind of different way, showing this variety, this range, our ability to use different vocabulary. So washing machine ownership had only reached around 70%. So notice here we're using the past perfect, right? Because we're referring to a period of time in the past, and of course it ended in the past. So we're using the past perfect. Had, and then of course reached with ed on the end, and then we're giving that figure, 75%. We're using the word only there because of course it is smaller than the other two. The other two reached 100%, but this one has only reached 75%. And then we stop there. We've covered this whole period of 100 years in one short paragraph there with 3 sentences. Of course, this is quite a large paragraph for the detailed paragraphs with 3 quite large sentences. But we've needed to do that to compare the 3 different appliances. Of course, in the next detail paragraph, we're not going to have to include quite as much information as that. You can see that second line graph is not quite as detailed, right? We don't have as many lines, right? There's only one for us to describe. I'm going to leave that for the next video though, because I think we've probably included enough information in this video to cope with for now. But the next video, I'll go on to explain how we're going to write the second detail paragraph. But to be honest, it's going to be quite similar to what we've done in this first detail paragraph here. But hopefully that helps, right? It helps you think about how we're going to approach writing detailed paragraphs for line graphs. We can use this kind of approach where we start describing the details at the beginning, moving on through the paragraph, through the line graph and the information there until the end as well. It's this really quite nice and really quite simple way to write about a line graph. I hope it's been useful for you. If it was useful, then do remember to click the like button. And if you haven't already, remember to click subscribe so you don't miss out on any similar videos in the future. So there we go. Thanks for watching, guys, and see you again in the next video.